Welcome back to the Locker Room Podcast. My name's Ross Bennett. I'll be the host for you today. Long time since I've been hosting, and very delighted today to have a guest with me that I've worked for a number of years now, for maybe 4 years, I think, Aussie, within QPR and also at London, that we'll touch upon within this podcast. So I'll let Aussie introduce herself in a minute, but she's the lead psychologist at QPR Academy at the minute, and she'll go through the different roles and the journey she's taken to get here so far. But just before we delve in, I just want to say a big thank you to our sponsors, Ripped.app, who have come on board again for us for a second term. So delighted to have them on board. They're a platform that can aid coaches, sports scientists, SSE coaches around a whole different range of services around programs, monitoring, tracking athletes and players remotely. And they're a fantastic service that we've continued to use here at Daily Sports Science. So massive thanks to Ritz, who are our sponsors for this podcast and coming on board with us again for this term. Okay, Aussie, so I briefly mentioned you there, but I think it'd be great for listeners to just hear your journey, and you just let the listeners know exactly kind of your journey, how you got into this role. What did we say the name of this podcast was going to be? It was something quite funny.
Oh yeah, I can't even remember.
Playing with
Playing
the
with your
mind,
mind or something like
yeah,
that.
that's it. Yeah, so it's a site-based playing with your mind, a bit tongue-in-cheek, but yeah, I think it's great for listeners to hear of your expertise and especially from a coaching perspective, how they can get info from you. So if you don't mind running through your journey, I think it'd be fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you for having me today. And like you said, I'll just run through kind of my academic and how I got into sports psychology, and then also as a player as well, how sports psychology has kind of influenced and played a part in my netball career. So I first did an undergraduate in psychology and early childhood studies, thinking I wanted to work with specifically with children. And towards the end of that degree, I kind of started finding out a bit more about sports psychology and realized that, especially as I'd been playing netball, it was just something I knew sport was always something I wanted to do and have as part of my career. So identifying sports psychology as something that I could do was really quite profound for me. So at the end of my undergrad degree, decided not going to do child psychology anymore. I'm going to focus more on sports psychology. So I got a master's in psychology just because I felt like I needed a bit more of an understanding of all the psychological principles, having split my undergrad degree into two, with the sport and early childhood, with the psychology and early childhood studies rather. And then I did a second master's in sport and exercise psychology, which led me to where I am now, currently a trainee, about 1.5 months out from qualifying. And I've been, as Ross mentioned, working at QPR with him in the academy for about, I think it's been about 3 years now, actually. Started with a whole team of trainees and a supervisor here. And as time progressed, I've now, like Ross said, I'm now the lead psychologist at the academy, which is it's been a challenge. It's been an adjustment, especially still being a trainee, but I think it's really helped me develop my career, and kind of my knowledge as well. Now that I'm working in a broad range of areas, so I'm working with injured players, I'm working with people that have been released, I'm working with people that have just signed to do their scholar years. So it's given me a broad range of experience, to put under my belt, and also working with coaches as well, which I think is really important. And I know we'll delve into a bit later on, but I think it's been really great working at QPR, just to develop that experience. I've also done bits with kind of grassroots netball teams, regional netball teams, some rowers, Gaelic football, which again we'll speak about, and then a one-off session with a team in the Champions League. So getting some more experience under my belt, as I go through. As a player, I'm currently, the last season I played, which was just before COVID, I was in Premier League One netball. So that's a national level. And I kind of got through netball quite quickly. So I played at university. Overheard my coach actually saying that she thought I could be really great, and I was like, right, I've got to make it now. And so I joined a club when I finished my undergrad, and kind of rise through the ranks in that club, and yeah, I made it to the Prem team, which is it's really good, but also really scary at how quickly it happened, because you don't really get much time to settle into a team and to get to know your teammates, which I think is really important when you're kind of constantly rising through the ranks. And so I think sports psychology for me has been really important in just remaining resilient, knowing what I want to achieve, what my goals are, and also learning how to develop as a player more purposefully and with more intent.
I think that's really fascinating, Ozzy. About, so just so people understand, that's the league below the Super League, right? So second division, old money's term in football and stuff like that.
Absolutely.
Which is a very high standard. So I think that's a credit to you, first of all. Also, has it made you see, so as a player, when you go through different experiences and you experience things from coaches, and like you say, you've had to have a lot of resilience, but then seeing the support staff side of how players are spoke about in both a positive light and sometimes, unfortunately, a negative light in decision as well. Has that had a big impact on you and how you view yourself in your sport?
I think netball and other sports are very different from football, where a lot of my experience has been had. So within netball, it's kind of, I wouldn't say not as organized, but at the level that I play, because it's not as professionalized as football, you don't have that much support staff. So you're definitely doing a lot of the work for yourself, whether it's sports science, whether it's physio, you kind of have to find your own resources. However, working within football, it's definitely made me more aware of how difficult it is for actually support staff to sometimes make those decisions, because you're still talking about people, you're still making decisions about people's careers and futures. And within football, more kind of it's more impactful than maybe netball might be. So it's definitely given me an awareness of kind of the different sides of it, but also what my role is to make it more easy for the players, and also to make sure that coaches and support staff are doing it in the most appropriate way.
Yeah, good answer. I think there's huge parallels with maybe netball and Gaelic football, I think, in terms of a lot of the listeners would be club level Gaelic football coaches who have very limited financial resource and support, would be a coach, maybe a physio. So we'll get into the stuff in terms of what the coaches could maybe do for their teams a bit later on. So Ozzy, quite a broad question, but I just wanted to chuck you in to start off with. So what does sports psychology mean to you? And what's its impact, taking it from its original psychological term, what's its impact that it can have in the sporting environment?
Right. So you often hear people using kind of mental skills training in kind of exchange with sports psychology. And that's not to say that sports psychology doesn't kind of entail some sort of mental skills training and learning about developing different um, mental skills. But I think what you've said is really important, that it is originally taken from psychology and applied psychology. And I think sometimes we forget that sports psychologists and sports psychology is psychology first. It's not just because it's got the sport in it, it doesn't take away from the fact that it is psychology and it is working with people, kind of their development, their social development, sometimes the neurobiology, so how teenage brains work and how that influences the way they learn. So I think it's really important to understand that sports psychology is psychology, but it's just in the sport world, just like business psychology would be working with corporate organizations, or occupational psychology would be working in that specific field. Sports psychology is psychology just within a sport or exercise context.
Yeah, really interesting to say that, because I had something later on to speak about, but it's quite prevalent now. Like, I've had a lot of discussions with my boss here, and we've had lots of discussions amongst us as a department. And I think sometimes there's a feeling that psychology can be, like, with all due respect, this is in a respectful way, more of a counselling service, and they think that that's completely different to the sports psych world. But actually getting the person, the individual, right from a well-being perspective and making sure their head's right, not even talking about the context of the sport, is going to have an impact to the sport, right? So do you see the two are really linked, or do you see avenues where there is a niche for like real sports performance psychology, if you like, and then the kind of, as you said, the well-being and the psychology stuff first?
I think it's absolutely linked. They're inextricably linked. You are dealing with humans at the end of the day, and humans have to perform, whether it's at an elite level or just into day-to-day life. Everyone is always performing. And I think if we take away the well-being side of it, you'll come up with those classic cases of people developing mental health illnesses or burnout or stuff like that. And then ultimately, I would agree, if you take away the performance side of it, it just becomes sort of it loses its elite nature, it loses its performance side. So you can't have one without the other, I'd say. I think they both lend themselves to one another. But I think ultimately, dealing with human beings, you have to understand them as individuals and how they're thinking and feeling, because that is what enables them to perform. And without doing that, you aren't going to be able to get the best out of them.
For sure. It's a really good answer, Ozzy. So what do you think then are like the little details or the extra bits that are added in sport that might make it different to someone seeing a psychologist or a counsellor outside of the sport?
So I think being a sports psychologist, you are often embedded into the culture of the organization. And so you have those nuanced understandings of what happens. So you know what happens at training, you know a bit about injury and how that specifically influences kind of a person's well-being. So not to say that a counselor wouldn't understand that, but you just have a more in detail or in-depth understanding of, okay, this means this, and they might get released, and what does that mean for their future, and all the different things that kind of need to be put in place to help an individual deal with sport as an organization, sport as a kind of microcosm of society, if you will.
Perfect. And this might be one that not controversial, but where does the care stop? So like obviously you mentioned there a lot of retain and release. Like once the player leaves the building, essentially they're not under the remit of yourself anymore. But them going into society, there could still be psychological things going on. Like how logistically, how difficult is that for aftercare, and what's your views around that?
Yeah, that's a really tricky one. And we've seen in kind of news recently what's happened to some players that have unfortunately been released, and then the outcome of it all for them hasn't been great. So I think it is really difficult to understand what is the responsibility of a club once they're not there. They're not yours, like you said. But I think one thing that we can do as members of a club is to support them while they're here so that they build those skills to deal with being released or transitioning out of a career or to another club. But also, there are sports psychologists that work independently and have an understanding of the kind of things that happen in a sports organization. And so it's maybe for us to make ourselves more known and kind of shout a bit more about the profession and say, we are here, we are able to provide support on a one-to-one basis outside of your organization. I also know that there are kind of organizations, charities that are starting up for sports in general to help athletes dealing with any sort of mental health issue, or just kind of the transition out of sport, the release, retain, kind of the questions that come around that. And so it might require a bit of digging for an individual to find out what's available outside of their sport club or their environment, but there are resources that are available to them that are more specific to sport, which they can utilize.
Great stuff. Do you see that like consultancy space being filled more and more? Like over the as it got bigger, is it going to get bigger and bigger, you think?
Absolutely. And as the profession kind of grows and there are more routes to becoming a sports psychologist, I think we will continue to see an increase in consultancies, an increase in individuals who understand sport and what it entails, and the things that come out of it for players, and you know the stresses that impact players and all that stuff, their families as well. It's not just them, it's you know academy players, it's their families, it's their parents, it's their brothers and sisters. If you're in the first team, or you know it's your wife, it's your child, it's not just you. And so as it grows, there is definitely a space for us, but also I'm seeing that there are a lot more people coming into that space, which is good to see.
Well, that's great. I think that you hit the nail on the head about the transition period. So like I think QPR are quite good in the sense of letting players know early. It's always a horrible part of the business to say they're not going to be kept on. But I think then you've got a period of transition that you can really prepare them for when they leave the club initially, so that they're ready to deal with life after that club. Doesn't mean they're not going to find a new club or move on in their life. Ozzy, just moving on a little bit around, because I know you've done like quite a bit of research amongst the staff and stuff here around mental health, and it's a topic that's very prevalent, and especially within this COVID situation, it's come to the forefront, I think. Can you just speak a little bit around the work you've done within this space, and maybe how it applies and how important it is to not only sport, but I guess society as well?
Sure. So, like you said, I did some research quite recently on mental health literacy amongst coaches and support staff. I did this study at QPR. So, we ran a mental health literacy program, myself and some colleagues. And I evaluated the outcomes of it. So, did it help increase knowledge of mental health illnesses? Did it help increase confidence to support people with mental health illnesses? Did it help increase understanding and knowledge of what mental health illnesses were? And the outcomes of it were really strong. It showed that it was effective. It showed that there is a need and a desire for coaches and support staff to learn about this, because more as it grows and as people become more aware of it and its occurrence in sport, people are kind of awakened to the fact that they can't shy away from it anymore. It's not something that can be kind of put in the corner and we'll deal with this in isolation. People are starting to understand that it's kind of a part of sport. The stresses that I mentioned before, so injury, concussion, all those different things that release, retain, those are things that really influence people and their emotions and their kind of well-being. And having an understanding of that and what the outcome of that could be in terms of mental health and mental health illnesses is really important for coaches to understand. It also showed that there are still some barriers. So especially within football, it's kind of the question of performance and well-being, which we spoke about. It's kind of that conversation on, well, if you're one, you can't be the other. And I think the more football and footballers come out and say, okay, I've experienced this and I've survived and I've gotten through it and I'm still an elite professional and I'm still at the top of my game. I think the more that people do that, the more demystified it becomes, the less stigma is around it. And I think the more that we talk about it as well and realize that it's not just something that happens outside or is a one-off event, that actually it can be a multiple time event in a club or in an academy. I think the more we talk about that and understand that and realize that, the more we can do about it, really. If it's in isolation and we keep it hidden and keep stigmatizing it and keep kind of brushing it to the side, the more powerful it becomes, and for the individual and then for the club and collective as a whole.
Yeah, great stuff, Ozzy. I think those workshops alongside the research that you did were fantastic in educating, everybody around the different mental health kind of conditions or illnesses or stuff that people can get. But more importantly, I think the triggers of those, because like I've been through, I'm very open in it. I've been through, when I was playing as a young kid in the academy, an eating disorder that was triggered from a coach that wanted to change people's diets and didn't have any real knowledge in that, just wanted people to eat well. And the intention from the coach was to make sure that you're recovering and eating well. But, it's the individual personalities of the players that can then lead them down different paths. How do you see that within your experiences with different coaches? And do you think there's a lot more to be done around the words that coaches use and the language coaches use to stop these things occurring in young players?
Absolutely. I think there's a large onus on coaches to understand that they are ultimately the gatekeepers to players. So they're the people that kind of spend the most time with them, should really know them in depth, know their personality, what makes them tick, kind of have that personal relationship with players. And so having that responsibility also means that they need to be aware of the things that they're letting off, whether that's kind of consciously or subconsciously, having an awareness of their body language, of what they're saying, of the tone with which they're saying things, because that can really influence people. We often don't realize, and we say this a lot of what you say, a lot of what you give off isn't verbal. It's the way you say, the way you carry yourself, it's the way your face is, it's the way, those different things that aren't verbal those are what really impacts on what people pick up on. So I think there's a lot that coaches can do as gatekeepers of players and mental health for players, to actually learn about the triggers, like you mentioned, but also how their words can hold weight with players.
Yeah, totally agree. And you know, from support staff, but even this year, since I've been doing more of an active coaching role, like you're constantly aware of how you're projecting yourself. And I think coaches need more accountability on that, because it's too easy to do something that's going to affect one, maybe two players and not be accountable for that. Like, where's they need to be held accountable for to some degree for that. A big one is that I've spoke about, Ozzy, on numerous podcasts before, is about nutritionists. And like, especially around, because I've gone through that experience, the sensitivity of food and the relationship different people have with food is massive. And we've seen it over the years with certain cases. Like, I feel the nutritionists need to start working closer with the psychs, or at least having formalized education around that sort of language and behavior change and stuff around that. Do you think, I mean, yeah, do you think there's a scope for that to be a crossover there?
Absolutely. And I was actually speaking with a nutritionist here at QPR last week, and we were looking at a paper together that was looking at kind of the psychological and nutritional impact and benefits that we could gain from each other, and especially in terms of return to sport post-COVID. So I know here that I've learned so much from working with a nutritionist, not as anything that's required, but just by virtue of being curious and wanting to develop myself. And I know that he would probably say the same. We have conversations with each other. We're quite free with each other on our knowledge, like to catch up about what this might mean for this player and kind of do mini case studies, if you will. So I definitely think there is room for there to be an overlap between nutrition and psychology, especially with injured players. You know, often when players get injured, they think, I shouldn't eat so much because I'll get fat and then I won't be able to. Actually, it's eating that helps you restore your body. You need that fuel to help your body recover. And so it's me understanding that from a nutritional point of view and speaking with the nutritionist. And then when I'm having one-to-ones with those injured players, relaying that information and kind of using my psychological skills and my awareness of how to speak with people and all those different skills that I've learned to actually help them understand that eating isn't the problem. It's going to help them in their rehab.
For sure. And I think it's about, especially with the support staff and coaches, the openness for everybody to learn off each other, and just having that openness in your, I guess, that growth mindset that you want to improve and take the best of each other.
Absolutely.
100%. Moving on to a term now, Ozzy, that I think this goes into now the performance side and the sports performance side. I think you can do this in everyday life, I agree, but I think it's something that, you know, yourself and the psychology team previous has done really well in driving this. And it's this concept around purposeful practice.
Right.
And speaking a little bit about the philosophy here, which is based around technical excellence. There's a lot of repetition of close skill stuff that we feel is the foundation for technical basics, I guess. It's easy to get bored and to go through the motions, and for players and coaches to not drive something at the right standard. Could you talk a little bit around purposeful practice and the different things that link into it, to making sure that every part of training is accountable and you're maximizing what you're getting out of it?
Absolutely. So purposeful practice, also known as deliberate practice, is basically being intentional with the way you practice. So I'm sure all of us will have heard about the 10,000 hour rule, about if you practice for 10,000 hours, you will become an expert in whatever you've practiced in. And that's not to say that's not true, but it's more about the way you practice, and how you practice the thing that you're trying to become an expert in. So whether you do that 10,000 hours, if you do it just anyhow, so you know, you don't put intent into it, you're just kind of playing around, throwing a ball around for argument's sake, you're not going to get as much out of it as if you set a focus on what you want to get out of the sessions that you're using that 10,000 hours for. So for example, let me use my netball knowledge, for example. If I wanted to get better at shooting, I could go to a post for 10,000 hours and just throw the ball and aim for the goalpost and hope that it would go in. That is not purposeful practice. Purposeful practice is going there and saying, okay, today I'm going to focus on bending my knees. that is the skill I'm going to focus on when I'm shooting, and I'm going to get feedback on that. So did I bend my knees enough times? When I got the shot in, how did I bend my knees? What did it feel like? Those are the things that you want people to start thinking about when they're developing purposeful practice. Within purposeful practice, there are kind of a number of key things that you want to also think about. Getting out of your comfort zone. So if, again, using that analogy of shooting, I'm not always going to shoot from right under the ring, because that's not going to help me get better. I'm going to use a range of different areas from the shooting D to help me get better at long range shooting, at close up shooting, at mid range shooting. The other thing that you want to also involve in your purposeful practice, which I mentioned, is feedback. So you want to get feedback either from yourself or someone that's watching you. So how did I do this? What did I do to make it work? What do I need to do better in order to make it work? Those are some of the questions that you want to ask. And then the other thing that I've mentioned, intention, that is really setting a focus, a specific focus that you can measure. So for example, mine would be shooting and bending my knees. That would be my specific focus that I'm focusing on for that 1 hour of that 10,000 hour. And that is what I'm going to measure myself on at the end of that session. So those are just a few things that you can start to implement with your players, or even with yourself as coaches. What do I want to get out of this session to develop myself as a coach? Those are some of the things that you can start to implement to help development.
Really good detail. And I think that the feedback stuff comes into the journals that we use here. So the players having to, not only kinesthetically feel that different technical elements that you spoke about, but having some sort of written feedback after and shining the light on the technique. I think coaches need to get better then at the detail, coaching the detail and telling the kids the detail, or the players, because if they don't know what the different technical requirements are, then how are they meant to really focus on the detail and practice purposefully, I guess.
Absolutely.
Ozzy, that's great stuff. I think it links on a little bit now to where I kind of want to take it to when you ended up in Gaelic football, which probably something 4 or 5 years ago you never thought you'd be working in, and I was the same, to be honest, until Kieran asked me to come in. So so obviously Kieran asked you to come in and do some work at London. I'm interested, with all your experience you had as a player in netball and then having a look at the support side of things in professional football, how you viewed London and Gaelic football, which is still perceived as amateur, albeit inter-county level, trying to take it to that next level. What were your initial views on the sport and the culture and things when you walked in? What were the massive differences and what you saw?
Yeah, so definitely some parallels between netball in terms of the lack of professionality, even though you are kind of at an elite level. So that really hit home with me, and it kind of it hit home. The not having support staff like you'd have at the academy, or having people that have day jobs and then come to training in the evening. That really struck me as something that I was familiar with. So that was really nice to come into and have an environment that I felt like, okay, I understand why they need this almost, because there is such little time that they want to get as much out of it as possible. And I think wherever you are, that someone wants sports psychology, I think that's brilliant, because it shows an openness, it shows that growth mindset, wanting to learn something new, wanting to add an extra element of kind of sport and performance to players and to coaching and to the club. I think coming into Gaelic football, I'd never really watched it, never really heard of it. Again, saw parallels in the way it was played and some of the drills that they did with netball, which was nice again. But one thing that I did notice in terms of culture, and again, that's probably because of it not being kind of elite and not having as many resources as, say, football. But I was one of 3 women in the club, so as support staff. And when I walked in, I noticed that my colleague that I worked with as a psychologist, she was the second female, and then I believe the nutritionist was the other female. And I think I noticed that it was the beginning of my training experience, so there was so much going on for me anyway. I was trying to figure out whether I knew what I was actually doing, or whether what I was doing was beneficial. I knew sports psychology was beneficial, but I didn't have the understanding of what I was doing and then my own philosophy of practice when I came into Gaelic football. So I was really working with my colleague to try and develop that. I think we were quite limited in the time that we spent with players and with staff. And I think that was maybe one of the downfalls because, again, limited resources, limited time. And I think the only saving grace for that was that they were adults. And so they could just grasp the concepts and run with it if they wanted to. And I think that was on them to do. We provided the content and then they could decide whether they'd want to run with it. If I was to do it again, I think a bit more time with players to actually develop those skills and an understanding of kind of what we were trying to teach them in terms of purposeful practice, in terms of strength, in terms of communication. I think that would have been really good to help us kind of cement the learning that we had started there. And then something else in terms of culture that I noticed was that not only was I the only one of three females, but I was the only Black person, and that really resounded with me. And it's something that I've reflected on, just because within sports psychology, it's actually quite a male-dominated sport, and so being the antithesis of both, so being a woman and then being a Black woman, it's something that I've had to look at my position on and being like, okay, how can I influence this space, being a minority in this space? And so coming into Gaelic football, it was something that I had to navigate. It's something that I had to become comfortable with in myself, being someone that stuck out and someone that was very obviously different. Not to say that I was called out on it or that anything necessarily happened. I mean, there was one game that I did think, would this have happened if I was a white woman? Because my colleague was a white woman, and we had a bit of a different experiences at one of the games that we went to. But it's something that I've had to navigate in terms of the culture in Gaelic football, but also what if this happens in a different sport? How will I react? How will I navigate it? How will I show my worth outside of what my gender or race is?
Yeah, really fascinating, and thanks for your honesty with that, Ozzy. Do you think then, as an industry, as a society, it probably goes deeper than just the sport? Like there are more opportunities, and there's more, I guess, openness for yourself as a Black woman practitioner to get experience, to hopefully receive no discrimination, whether that be obvious or subtly, like you said. Do you think things are moving in the right direction personally, or have we got a long way to go?
I do think things are moving in the right direction. I do think it's partly to do with personnel at a club, so who is there and who can make those decisions. So I'm really fortunate to be here at QPR, where I feel completely comfortable just because there is so much diversity within the club, both in terms of race, but then also I'm not one of three women in the club. I think we've come a long way in terms of diversity and inclusion, in terms of sport and practitioner diversity and inclusion, but there is a long way to go. Like I said, sports psychology is a white male dominated field, but there are hubs where we as a community of Black people who are practitioners and who want to further ourselves within this industry kind of can figure out how we do that and how we implement techniques and strategies to get ourselves in, because ultimately wherever you go there is going to be diversity, and so there needs to be, I feel, a representation of that within personnel, within professionals, in clubs, and then in the wider population as well.
Yeah, totally agree, Ozzy. Well said. Just going back then to the London stuff and the limited time you had with the players, just so the listeners know, what sort of stuff did you do for the players in your limited time? I know we had some workshops, probably because you'll explain, but their education from a psychology perspective was probably zero, never been exposed to it. And then it might have been the individuals. What did you prioritize and focus on with the limited time that you had?
So from my memory, I think we prioritized individual work. So I think we gave 4 workshops on purposeful practice, values, communication, and one other one that has just slipped my memory. But we did 4 workshops, and then lots of individual work. So my colleague, who was kind of a specialist, or is a specialist in injury and injury psychology, she worked with the majority of the injured players, long-term injured, and really that was where she was. And then I kind of worked, as I said, it was the beginning of my training experience. So I was working more specifically with people that had kind of confidence issues or just wanted to gain a bit of resilience. So it was me teaching them skills. It was me understanding their values and how they could use their values on the pitch. It was me understanding their strengths and then trying to relay their strengths into what they do well and how they could do it again in terms of that purposeful practice and repetition. So that's how we split up, kind of focused heavily on the one-to-one stuff with a few workshops here and there. And then we did training observations as well to kind of try and implement those learning bites that we delivered.
Yeah, fantastic. How were those individuals then selected for one-to-ones?
So the coaches would identify kind of the players that were kind of their stars, if you will, and or those that they thought would benefit more from psychological support. So if they had psychological support, they could be here. So that's how kind of those one-to-ones were selected. And then with the injuries, it was kind of long-term injury, that's 6 weeks plus. They would see my colleague. Short-term injured, they probably have some one-to-one support either with myself or with my colleague. But that's kind of the selection process that was used to get people one-to-ones.
And do you think from a culture perspective, players bought into it? Did you feel any resistance from players? Mixed bag?
I think it was mixed. I think there are some players who really care and believe that that sport is a mental thing, not just a physical thing. And so they will come and talk to you. Those are the players that will talk to you on the sidelines or will have a chat with you and ask you, what do you think about this? Those are the people that almost take ownership for their learning. And then there are the people that heavily rely on coaches telling them what to do. And I think those are the people that you need to try and get more buy-in from. So trying to get them to understand that their development is also in their hands, basically. Coaches can only do so much, tell you what to do, try and make sure that you're doing it there and then. But more often than not, coaches aren't seeing you every day in that environment. Coaches are only seeing you for a couple of hours a week. So what you do outside of there and you taking ownership for yourself is what's going to determine whether you are a star athlete or you are just kind of making the cut by the skin of your teeth.
Yeah, I think that's really important, especially when they go onto the pitch. You think of Gaelic football, it's a huge pitch. The instructions you can get to players is very minimal, and they've got, like every sport, they've got to think real time about problem solving. And those players that could do that were the ones that I guess excelled a little bit more. Maybe we missed a trick there, Ozzy, with focusing on the better players. One of the terms you spoke about there was about resilience, and it's a term that, you know, we have it as one of the 3 R's here that you and Misha and stuff have set up prior. It's a big term that's bandied around, especially now, and even on coaches' courses. It's like the big buzzword that they use from a psychology perspective. What does it mean to you, like from a definitive perspective, but also real life? And how do you go about developing that?
Sure. So resilience is basically that bounce back ability. In terms of definition, it's about getting up when you have failed, or when you perceive you have failed, or when you've kind of not made the cut. And although I think we have an understanding of what that definition is, it really amazes me as to how, even though we understand that it's about failing and then getting back up after you failed, people still associate resilience with toughness and not failing and just constantly going almost to that place of burnout. And I think we need to have an understanding and just remember the actual definition. It's like you said, it's a buzzword, it's going around everywhere. And I think it's almost lost its actual meaning of, we are human. Part of the human experience is sometimes failing. It's sometimes being knocked down. It's sometimes not doing your best and being disappointed. But that's not the end of the story. You can choose whether you get back up again. And that is the place between getting knocked down and getting back up again where resilience lives. And it's almost like you want to get knocked back or you want to fail, because that's also where the learning happens. That's where you get better. That's where you understand what the difference between you doing it excellently and you kind of just making it is. That is the perfect place for you to learn. And so I think we also need to not shy away from failure or perceptions of failure, because actually that's where the magic happens, in my opinion.
Yeah, I was just about to say, it comes back to your analogy of you trying to practice your shooting and taking yourself out of that comfort zone where your success rate isn't high, and actually internalizing what you need to do to improve on that. we have a concept here, zone of proximal development, where you're trying to develop players in that zone where they're getting some success, but definitely getting some failure, so they understand what's going wrong around that. Are we, this is not controversial, but this might be something that a bit of debate. Are we as a society now, and especially from the older generation of players who are now coaching, it's a big thing that they speak about from their experiences. Do we treat players and people and kids and everyone from all ages differently in society now, that's having an effect on someone's resilience? Are they more dependent on coaches, dependent on significant others outside of sport to help them? Whereas back in the day, from what coaches would say, you get on with it, and you have to kind of develop that resilience naturally, otherwise you're going out the game. Where do you see that and the support that we give to players?
I actually think that's really interesting, because that generation of people that didn't have that much support, we're seeing now that that's the generation that are actually saying they could have used a bit more support. So I think it's interesting that it's almost that they're saying one thing, but actually their experiences are showing us something completely different. And I'd almost frame that question a bit differently. Not are we doing too much, but what can we do differently as support staff to ensure that we're promoting resilience? So are we having an awareness of our players' mental states? Are we having an awareness of where they are emotionally? Kind of, do they have an emotional awareness? Are we using the right language? Are they interacting with their teammates properly or appropriately? All these things that kind of influence resilience that coaches can definitely play a part in. We need to be ensuring that we actually have an awareness and an understanding of how to develop those skills in players, because like I said before, coaches are the gatekeepers. They're there constantly with players. And so if coaches can see this and kind of see whether a player has the right mindset or needs to work on their emotional regulation or their ability to communicate better with their teammates, that is how you build resilience. I'm always kind of shy away from an understanding of anything psychology that says that we need to take away or that we're not doing enough of. We should focus on what we can do more of to promote resilience or to promote purposeful practice or whatever it is that an individual needs. Because when we focus on what a player needs rather than in terms of what they're not getting, that's where we can make the most difference. It's not necessarily always what we're not doing. It's something that we could do more of that is more beneficial for a player.
Yeah, good stuff. I think that brings me on to a point I was going to speak about later, but that coach interaction with the psychologist is probably an area that I think isn't at the level where it could be to optimize this psychological kind of development in players. And I think that's for a number of different reasons. I think, resistance from coaches or a lack of awareness and understanding of the mental side of the game probably is the first and foremost from coaches. But how do we break that down? Because I think now psychologists have got really good relationships with players, or as a whole, I'm speaking generally here, but how do we then move into that coaching side and really work closer with the coach to develop that holistic approach? Where do you see that going?
I think you've raised a really important question, because both disciplines come with different skills. So a coach has in the past and can teach me about a sport that helps me with my practice. Likewise, I can help a coach identify whether their language is helpful or not helpful to an individual. And here we've done actually a lot of work. We ran a range of communication workshops within the academy that was for parents, coaches, and players to understand what was helpful communication and what wasn't helpful communication. So I think language and understanding what language is best to get the best out of players is one area that coaches and psychs can work together on. Another area is probably identifying all the work that we've done with players. So we've done stuff on emotional regulation, on purposeful practice, on all that stuff with players. It's getting coaches to have a buy-in to that. So understanding why that's important, how they can use it in their time. Because like I've said several times here, they have the most time with players. So if they can get the right language and start using psychology language in coaching sessions or in the gym or wherever they might be, that is what's going to help embed psychology more into the culture of sport. So I think there is so much room for coaches and psychologists to work together, and sports and support staff as well, to work together in a kind of multidisciplinary way so that we can get the best out of players.
Yeah, totally agree. We speak a lot about like ILPs here, individual learning plans, and individual programs for players, technically, physically, and how we're going to get the best out of them each session. But I think that needs to come from a psychological perspective as well. What does that player need at this moment in time? How are we going to develop the skills of this player? I think that's where we need to shift slightly. And the EPPP, it has a lot of downfalls, but it might just be the platform for an emergence of more psychology in sport in the next few years, and hopefully then, as you said, consultancy will rise off the back of it and hopefully become the norm, I guess, within most sports.
Yeah.
We might have touched on it already, Ozzy, but what if you went into a team, you went into a new role, what 3 things would you work on? Would you like to work on as a general? You can talk about individualizing things as well if you want to, but what 3 things would you say, I really want to focus on this, I think this is important, they haven't had psychological support, and then how would the coach assist you with developing those things? It doesn't have to be 3, it can be whatever you think is most important.
I think purposeful practice is at the top of that list. People, athletes, coaches, we all need to learn and keep learning how to develop skill appropriately. And I think purposeful practice is at the top of that list because it is both psychology and sport. It's developing skill, but it's also using kind of the psychology behind developing that skill. So I think it's a really nice way to get buy-in, first of all, from people that might be a bit skeptical about sports psychology, but it's also something that has been proven to help improve performance. So that would be probably my number one thing going into a new setting. I think what's really important for both coaches, support staff, and players as well is to have an understanding of their emotions and how that influences the way they think and behave and feel and their physiology. Because and then also how it affects other people's emotions and how they think, feel, and behave. Because we are social creatures. We thrive off having social connections and having those relationships. And there's this thing called emotional contagion where if you're feeling something, I can also feel it too, because that is how we are wired. Our brains are wired to couple together. And so I think having an awareness of where you are at and what you're giving off is really important, especially within team sports, because it can so easily kind of catalyze other people's emotions. And then before you know it, you see it in a game where someone gets angry and starts shouting, and then someone else starts shouting, and before you know it, it's just everyone's kind of on different pages and you're not working as a unit or as a team. So I think emotional awareness is something that's really important for players, coaches, support staff to learn about, to understand, and to really try and work on. And then the third thing following from that would probably be communication, because sometimes you hear it, again, like that analogy, people shouting at each other or not giving instructions in a specific way, or just not helping their teammates as effectively as they could using communication. I think it's important that players, teammates, coaches, support staff learn how to appropriately use language and communicate with one another so that performance and well-being is at the forefront of everyone's agenda.
Yeah, very well put. I think it's interesting you said about the emotional regulation, emotional control. Obviously, the players are the ones we look at staying in the now, but you see how many coaches do you see that are so emotionally invested, and the intention's right because it's about they want to do right for the job, but showing obvious frustration, showing in maybe a negative way at times, especially in development, can then have a massive impact on the players and their psychological well-being and state, and optimizing their performance is not there then. So it's true, isn't it? You just see stability is quite a good key word. I like stability in coaching, especially at development level. No, fantastic. So how can a coach then, just taking this to a scenario where a coach doesn't have access to psychological support, how can they take these umbrella terms and maybe actively change their behaviors or think about what they're doing and saying to really optimize the state of these players from a psychological perspective?
I think it takes a willingness to learn and an openness to want to do it. So if, for example, I went in and did a one-off session for an hour where I brought up these terms, someone that really wanted to develop in this area might try and find a book on it. So a good book on purposeful practice is one by Erickson and Paul. the name I've now forgotten, but if you Google that, or if you Google Purposeful Practice, Erickson's name will come up, and that will kind of catapult your journey into learning about purposeful practice. Similarly, with emotional awareness and communication, there are so many different books and resources that coaches can get online. Google it's so rich in resource that if we truly want to learn anything or find something out, all we have to do is search those key terms. So I think number one, it takes a willingness and an openness to realize that you don't know everything as a coach. You might think that you know about a person's mental well-being or their state, but you are not a psychologist. You are not a counselor or an expert in that area. You're an expert in as a coach, but you need to have that humility to say, okay, I need to work on this and learn a bit more about this area for my development as a coach, but also for the impact that I have on players.
Great stuff. And I think an awareness of how you're, like I spoke about before, but an awareness of what you're letting off through language and emotions and different ways as well. Thank you very much, Ozzy. Last couple, and I don't want to keep you too long. I know it's a working day for you here. So big one you mentioned was around rehab, and you spoke about a colleague who was, a specialist in that area. And I think that's an area that the psychology department have developed really well here, in terms of there's a huge need for it and a rationale for it, but also putting in a system in place. Why is rehab so important? So why is rehab such a key, period that the psychology team need to focus on, and what does the player go through? And then what sort of things do you do to help that and assist the player and put in place to get them through that phase?
So I think particularly within football and any kind of sport where it's extremely competitive and you're going through the pathways, players very quickly develop an identity as a footballer. So you'll ask them, you'll meet them on the street, what do you do? They won't say I'm a student. They won't say I'm XYZ. They'll say I'm a footballer. I play football. And so developing that kind of single focused identity and then getting injured means that you have nothing else to fall back on, or you haven't considered what else your strengths might be or who else you might be as an individual. And so that's why I think working with psychologists during the rehab process is so important, because it helps you explore the opportunities that are available to you whilst you're doing that process, or whilst you're recovering and getting back to where you want to be. But it also helps you almost develop another an understanding of your other identities. So who are you outside of football? What do you like to do? What do you enjoy? What would you do if you weren't playing football? All the questions that we don't ask because we're so focused on them making it, or maybe even because we're scared to ask or even raise that question. Okay, what if you don't make it? What if you only get to academy and then that's it for you? So I think going back to kind of injury, it's understanding that injury takes a player out of the game. Some people grieve during injury because it's like, I'm not able to do what I want to do in terms of career, in terms of making it into the first team, for example, if it's a career-ending injury. So it's about understanding what a player needs in terms of developing their identity, in terms of what opportunities are available to them, what in terms of how else they might be able to learn whilst they're in rehab. So you might get into coaching, so you're still watching the game, so you're still developing the skill. You might watch your some clips of yourself so that you're kind of still getting that feedback in your brain about, okay, this is what I would do if I was in this situation. So rehab's really important to work with the psychologist so that you're aware of what else you can be doing outside of rehab and outside of having this single-minded focus of just being a footballer. I think also, like you mentioned, there are different stages of rehab. So you've got the onset, you've got the rehab process, you've got kind of before you return to competition, which is full training, and then you've got competition. And you'll see a variety of things in these different stages. So in the beginning, I think it's a really important at the onset of an injury. I think it's really important that you're kind of getting in there as quickly as possible as a psychologist, because you're learning about the person. It might be a person that you've never worked with before, so you just want to know a bit about them, what they like doing, what they are about, kind of thing. during the rehab process, you might experience kind of boredom, lack of confidence, lack of motivation. And so those are kind of the things that you'd really be working on as a psychologist with an injured player, to build those different elements of an individual, so that when they do go back to playing, or if they do go back to playing, those aren't kind of factors that will be stumbling blocks for them. As you get kind of through that rehab process towards kind of return to sport and return to full training, you might have players experiencing a bit of ambivalence. So I really want to go back. I'm excited to go back. Can't wait to go back, but I'm scared. I'm scared I might get re-injured. I'm scared that I've been out for too long, and so I won't be able to kind of keep up with my teammates. I'm scared that I'll have lost skill. I'm scared that I won't be fit. So there's, yes, I want to get back, and that's all I've been waiting for. But also there's fear of re-injury and fear of going back into sport because of the what ifs. And so that's kind of some of the stuff that we'd be working through with injured players at that stage, kind of helping them navigate those feelings and working on skills that can help them overcome them. And then obviously when they go back into sport, it's just checking in with them, making sure that they still have goals, that they know that it won't be kind of straight back to peak performance, that there are still stepping stones once they come back into sport. And it's about setting those goals that are small and manageable, that still take them out of their comfort zone as well. So that purposeful practice stuff, but small manageable goals that help them get back to that peak performance.
Great stuff. Well done for taking us through that. It's a long process. I think it's important to note that the psychological state has a massive impact on the physiology as well. So like when they're in, like when you said they're returning to training, but they have that high level of fear and anxiety, like the stress hormone and the release of cortisol is going to put them at risk potentially of re-injury, even though like the physio and the sports scientists may have done everything physically they feel is appropriate for that player going through. So it's important to have that awareness, isn't it? So that when you're making decisions on players' return, you've got all the information at hand.
Absolutely. And I think it's also important that sports psychologists develop those relationships with players at the outset of injury, because developing that relationship also is another avenue for players to disclose that they're not feeling comfortable with being back, or that they have some anxiety, or that they have some tension. If you don't have this protocol where someone is working with a psychologist, it's very easy for that to be missed. Or if you don't have psychometrics, or kind of someone that knows that physiology and psychology are interlinked, it's very easy to miss those signs and then a player goes in and gets injured on their first game back. So I think that again is really important for psychologists to develop good relationships, both with staff but also with the players.
100%. And I'm going to be critical of coaches again, because I think, as you said, they are the gatekeepers, and it's important. Just because a player's injured, even a long-term injury, your job is still to develop that player. Now, physically, they can't do the stuff on the pitch that you would normally do. So I think sometimes coaches forget that they still have a job to develop this player in other creative ways, using analysis, using tasks, get them involved in the coaching, as you said, because it's quite often a case you hear from players that they don't hear from a coach, or don't talk to a coach practically for 2-3 months until they're back on the pitch. So I think there is responsibility there from the coach to step up, keep developing the player, and also, make sure they know you still care about them and they're not forgotten.
Yeah, absolutely, because that lends to kind of the feelings of loneliness and isolation that players will feel when they're out. They're not with their teammates. They're not in that group or that bubble, and they might not be on the in with the inside joke. So having that coach make them still feel a part of that team is so critical for that psychological aspect of injury, because injury is a big risk factor for mental health illnesses in players. And if a coach isn't aware of that, which is why the mental health stuff is so important. If a coach isn't aware of that, they will not know that they still have a responsibility to that player.
100%. Well done, Ozzy. Well put. Last question from me, and then we'll wrap up. Differences between, like, you've worked with some senior players, you've obviously experienced playing at different levels, going through as a kid all the way up to adult. What's the differences that you would look at then between working with a first team or senior player, or an underage player coming through the ranks? What are some key or subtle differences that you see within those populations?
I think, for me, I think the content would stay the same. I think it's just about first of all, changing it to their developmental age. So like I mentioned before, neurobiology, the brain development of a teenager is not the same as the brain development of someone that's 26 in the first team. So it's about having an understanding of that myself, and understanding that behaviors that are seen at an academy level or at a pathway level might be because of the neurobiology of a 16-year-old, for example. I think, like I said, the content would stay the same, but it's about delivering it in a way that is more relevant to the person. So, for example, I might use more cultural analogies that are specific to a teenager at this age, in terms of how I would interact with them in the psychology session. Or for someone that's working or playing at Gaelic football, I might use a work analogy because they are still working most of the day and then going to train at the end of the day. So I think the content would stay the same. It's just about pitching it to a level where everyone who is participating understands it to the best of their ability.
Perfect. Ozzy, thank you very much for your time today. I think I got so much out of it just talking to you again. And I think the listeners are going to get so much out from that from a psychological perspective, and hopefully the start of this emergence of more psychologists and becoming more prevalent in different sports. So thank you so much for your time and coming on today.
No, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Perfect. And a debut for you on a podcast?
It is. I'll definitely be doing more. So thank you for...
Yeah, I think you put yourself in the shop window for bigger ones now. So we'll watch this space. Just for the listeners, I have to say thank you again very much to Ripped, our sponsors, Rip.app. If you head over to Rip.app as a listener, you'll be able to get some sort of promotion, and they're offering a deal for our listeners of the podcast as well. And also for those that aren't members of dailysportscience.com, please head over to the website, have a look at the range of services we can offer over there, and different promotion offers that are going on at the time. I think we're very, very close to a high number of coaches. It's been booming, so we're going to keep that service going, and the community's growing all the time. So, yep. Thank you very much for listening, DD Sports Science Locker Room Podcast, and thank you again to Ozzy, and we'll see you soon.